Hello, everyone, and Chag Sameach. It is strange to be observing Pesach in this way, and yet also kind of bizarrely familiar to be observing now our second Passover since we entered this period of isolation, of distance, of quarantine, of COVID 19 a little over a year ago. Um, and in some ways, it's like being in the wilderness. It's like where the Jewish people were when they left Egypt. And I've been thinking about how, in all sorts of ways over the past year, Hillel has become like the portable sanctuary that the Jews built in the desert. It's something you can take with you. It doesn't have to be embodied in one single place. The same is true for our campus. As much as we love our USC campus, it does not have to be something that lives only in University Park, but it's something that we found different ways to carry with us and different ways to make holy and different ways to make meaningful. And I'm really, really, truly fortunate to share some time today with some of the leaders on our campus who have been part of what has brought that experience to our community over the past year, and to embody together one of the most meaningful traditions of Passover, to have a conversation, to relate to an ancient story in new and different ways with lots of different voices, with people who come from backgrounds that vary, from identities that vary. And to invite everyone in to thinking about that story together. We have the auspicious group gathered of Dr. Carol Folt, the 12th president of the University of Southern California, Dean of Religious and Spiritual Life, Dr. Varun Soni, and our 2020-2021 presidents of USC Hillel, Sara, Okum, and Nicole, Waldman. And together we're just going to have a chance to talk as if we're around a virtual Seder table about some of the themes of this ancient and yet continually relevant story and how they've played for us in an incredibly unusual year. So to start, we're going to think about one of the most mystifying lines in the entire Haggadah. The start of the story itself, Arami Oved Avi. Two very different translations are out there for what those three words might mean. On the one end, my father was a wandering Aramaean, which most people believe is speaking of Abraham or Jacob, one of the ancestors of the Jews who lived in Egypt wandering in the desert. But it's just as often translated as an Aramaean destroyed or consumed my father, which could be a reference to Jacob serving for 14 years under the deceitful supervision of Laban. And the stories that we experience in our lives can just in the same way. They can evolve and they can change, and we can understand them differently depending on how we are emphasizing them. So, with all that in mind, uh, how are we thinking about the story of what we lived over this past year, and how has that emphasis possibly shifted along the way for you? And I'll invite Sara to start.
Yeah, so I think that for me, my story narrative has changed, but it also really hasn't changed. I've always really practiced being super mindful every night for the last 3 years. I've kind of written what I've been grateful for in like a gratefulness journal. And so it's more just like the narrative of it has changed. Like last year, I was abroad. It was my last day abroad, actually, like a year ago today. And so I was like trying to do a million things at once. And I was disappointed if I didn't get to do 12 things in a day. And now looking at my journal, it's more, I'm so grateful if I'm able to go on a walk or do something really simple. And those simple things matter way more to me. And it's just kind of making like the most of every single moment. So that's more how my story narrative has changed. But I think that's really comforting to know that the story can change. I think it makes life super exciting, kind of knowing that you always have something that will change or be different. It gives you something to look forward to. And the possibilities are really endless. So that's how my narratives have changed.
Yeah, I think that's definitely such an amazing thing that you brought up there, Sarah, just in terms of, being grateful for such simplistic, very just stable concepts of our life right now. And I think when I think of storytelling and just in connection to these themes of perspective, I don't think about like the stories, but more so how I'm telling the stories. And it kind of reminds me of the concept of how Judaism is such a dualistic, religion, culture, just practice of spirituality and nature, and just how there's so many different perspectives that go into that. And it also just makes me think of the different perspectives that have been taken place in our world today with an election year and with the pandemic, and just many different feelings and thoughts kind of hold these stories and these narratives across the board. And so when I think of storytelling, I think about trying to be like inclusive in my narrative, because there's just so many different perspectives going on right now at its height. And there's a lot of emotional and very heightened perspectives, and just trying to, find grounding and how to navigate that. That's what I think about.
I guess for me, I study religion. So the story of this year has been familiar in so much as that all of our sacred texts have these cataclysmic, apocalyptic sort of scenarios. This year we've seen floods, we've seen fires, there's a global plague, there was civil unrest. A few months ago, locusts descended upon India. I don't know if there's anything more biblical than locusts. And so it does seem familiar in so much as it reflects what our wisdom traditions have talked about for a long time. These events are opportunities for us to reimagine our world anew, to rethink how we act and move in the world. And so I do think this has been a story, a global story that connects us all as humans. But what I'm looking forward to is the birth of the new story. I think our students know that we're not going to go back to the world the way it was, and we shouldn't. We shouldn't go back to structural racism and healthcare inequity. We shouldn't go back to abusing animals and degrading our planet. We shouldn't go back to our screen addictions. We shouldn't go back to the things that got us here, and we've seen the limits of those things. And so for me, whenever we see these kinds of world-shaping, world-defining events in our scriptural traditions, they're opportunities of redemption, renewal, regeneration, and those opportunities are acts of storytelling. And so I hope that our students and all of us feel empowered as one story comes to an end and a new story begins, that we fully be the author of that story.
I love hearing the fact that you all have such different perspectives on it, but they're searching for meaning and turning that meaning into something that really changes lives. And I think that probably, as all the stories are written, if it is that transformation from the original story and now the stories we're telling, that it really means a lot to all of us. For me, some of the pandemic is very much in the real story I've had to deal with, the issues that were top of mind for people. And of course, in the beginning, it was just the speed. How could we make sure people weren't left behind, turn all the classes on a dime, get aid out to people? I mean, it was so filled with frenetic decision-making. Do it fast, get it right, do it fast. And then we went into the summer with all the incredible cries for justice and equity, and that too required lots of fast decisions, but none of these are really fast decisions. These are such meaningful, deep, they just require us to be so completely invested. And so I think it was a mixture of needing to make decisions and yet wanting so much, yearning to be able to have it really touch real people, hear how people were really feeling. And as we switched then to this period in the pandemic, we have a lot of people that the inequities they haven't caught up to many of us who are now feeling okay, we've got some security, we can see the end of the tunnel. So now my focus is on how do I help and keep us moving for those of us who are ready, and how do we not lose attention on those who have been left behind. But it is an evolving story. But you've just given me such a beautiful feeling from all of you that that story is about caring for people, and how do we keep the realness of it not getting lost in the frenetic and the fast and the decision making, the turmoil and the chaos of it. And that's probably the most important lesson I'm learning and trying to live as we go through it.
No, I mean, I'm feeling that sense of inspiration from hearing this group reflect, and I'm also feeling all of us cave to the temptation to make meaning and to make this into a story. right? It was like this, and now it's like this, right? And I also want to inject in there, and I heard some of this from Dr. Folt just now. It's not always that simple. Things haven't necessarily moved from fast to slow or from unresolved to resolved. And if there's one other common thread I felt during this, it's the possibility that on a daily basis, you could be in 17 different places throughout the day or even at the same time. And I think going back to the kind of launching pad of that mysterious piece of text in the Haggadah that means more than one thing, I hope that we've learned from this experience to be more okay feeling more than one way. And that is something, as we think too about what we do in wellness work, that I'm going to be continuing to think about. Moving along to you've set up some great segues already. First we heard about the plague-like atmosphere of the last year, which is another Passover theme, another Seder theme, and definitely one that maybe hits too close to home right now for a lot of people still, or in recent painful memory. And yet that narrative is central to the story of Passover, and in particular in how it pits two leaders, Moses and Pharaoh, against one another who seem to have countervailing styles. Pharaoh, hard-hearted, recalcitrant, unmoving. Moses, more quiet, persistent, and also in his way unwavering, but with this very different style. And Dr. Folt, I'd love for you to kick this off, but for everyone to share and speak together about how you've seen leadership during this type of crisis.
When I think of leadership during this crisis, I honestly feel it with great humility that it's a privilege to be leading during a crisis. It isn't, it's never something that you ever really want to run away from because people are looking to you. It doesn't make it easy, but it is a privilege and we have to try our best. So I think about that. I've thought of it a lot as through the eyes of caregivers, trying to be a bit of a caregiver myself, but I've been very in touch with what it feels like for the caregivers, the ones that have sacrificed themselves and put them forward. And then I've thought about it, tried in my best to empathize it through the people that are not only suffering from COVID, but all those other things. So it has forced me to think as a leader, to live the practice I always say, which is try to really walk in other people's shoes. And every time I do it, just hearing all of you, every time I do it, I feel like I learn a lot. When I think of the way you describe Moses versus Pharaoh, Pharaoh seems very much not interested in walking anybody else's shoes. So I am not going to aspire to that. I'm going to try to run away from that as my model as I think about that, what I aspire to. Also, Pharaoh seems associated with blaming. And boy, have we seen blaming at its very worst. So when I think about the opposite, if it's what Moses is looking to or exemplifying is that continued going forward, that seems really important, provided we are also walking in the shoes of others that are making that journey with us. So those are things that just thinking about the stories made me think about. So I appreciated the chance to contrast those, but they feel pretty like there's a big gap between those two approaches, or at least in the aspirational world. They are very different for me.
Yes, I love that you brought up the distinction between Moses and Pharaoh, and I would love to allude to a little story within the Torah that Dave reminded Sara and I of that has to do with Moses, which is that Moses is known for many things, but for one story that he's known for is his discovering of the burning bush, which was kind of a signifier or a spiritual connector to God that he came across in his travels. And something that I relate to within his journey and within his story is his intuitive and perceptive nature. This bush, was kind of just randomly in the middle of nowhere, and any commoner could walk by and not notice it. But Moses's spirituality and his connectiveness to God kind of brought it in through his path, and it helped him to identify the bush. And I just think with myself and in being a leader at this time, I just have had to, put my foot forward in making sure that I'm being as intuitive and as perceptive as possible, and going the extra mile to make sure that I'm noticing how my peers and how my the rest of my student team are feeling, and how they're acting and how they're perceiving just tasks on a day to day, and making sure that Sara and I are really shifting just in nature if we need to counteract that and to be supportive. So I think just kind of the intuitive nature that Moses provides in his path is something that really guides me in terms of my spirituality within Judaism, and just something that has really structured my leadership.
And going off of both of those perspectives, I feel like a common theme is also just being a really good listener. That's so important right now. Being a caregiver, like Dr. Folt was saying, and Nicole with the burning bush example, we have to be really, really good listeners. And especially during the pandemic, everyone has so much on their plate. So just not just like being a good listener with ideas, but like emotional, physical, mental, everything. We just have to be really, really understanding and sensitive leaders, I feel like right now, in order to really make sure people are engaged, adaptable, creative, and just okay in their like physical state.
I love all that. This is a real moment of shared suffering across the world, probably the likes of which we haven't seen since World War II. And what I've noticed is that no one is immune. And what that means is that we're all connected in a very human way, maybe for the first time in our lives, where we see how our actions affect the lives of other people we might not even know. And it feels like a very human moment. And so in terms of leadership, I've just tried to be human. We're all human. We're all going through a very human moment. The things that may make me sad probably make other people sad. The things that may bring me joy probably bring other people joy. We can mine our own experiences of what we're going through and assume that other people are struggling with the same kinds of issues, challenges, perspectives. So when someone smiles at me, even if it's on Zoom, it makes me feel good. I can smile at someone else. If someone calls me for no reason, I can call someone else. And I've got to say, I've learned a lot about this from President Folt. President Folt is the leader of a 70,000 person university. She is the mayor of a city within a city. And yet every person counts. Every student matters. Even though we're socially distanced, she wants to stay close. She remains close to so many people. I've only seen her find a way to yes. And it's pretty inspiring. I got to say, President Folt, your courageous, compassionate human leadership at a time when we need it most. Of course, leadership has many levels, but it starts at the top. And I've got to say, we're all really inspired by the way you've led us through this pandemic. So thank you.
That's really heartening. And I mean, I knew we would be getting special people together for this conversation. I think what we're striving to do is to see ourselves in the inspiring examples of the leaders we're lucky to be around, whether that's people like a university president or an inspiring dean of religious life or two transformational student leaders, or Moses, right? And so it's not hubris to see ourselves in these examples or to aspire for them. And even the through line of the idea, Dr. Folt mentioning running away from Pharaoh as an example, to Moses's burning bush moment, which was the result of him running away from Pharaoh, which I feel like we can't miss that unbelievable parallel, right? We have those choices all the time, right? Moses found himself in that desert because he made a decision not to be part of something toxic, to be part of something that was aligned with his values. We could have done this whole discussion just about him in that moment. And it's remarkable to see how these tests in our experience shape our leadership and the decisions we make in response to what we witness. In the realm of bringing it back to today again, and to return a little bit full circle to where I began our conversation with thinking about this tradition of relating to the story in a modern way. It's a story that has become a trope that is almost universally understood. That the Jewish people finding freedom from slavery, Moses triumphing in the end. These are an archetype at this point. The Hebrew word for Egypt is Mitzrayim, which is a narrow place, and that's the derivation of that word. And we think of traveling from narrowness to liberation to redemption. In any number of ways, we're still feeling narrowness and seeing hardship in the modern world. Michael Walzer notably wrote in Exodus and Revolution, wherever we go, it is eternally Egypt. There's a better place, a promised land. The winding way to that promise passes through the wilderness. So as we think again about the last year and where we're sitting today with a glimpse of the future accessible to us, what is that modern wilderness, and what does promised land mean and look like to you? And let's start with Dean Soni and go from there.
Well, sort of continuing on with the theme, to me, promised land is a return back to tribe, a return back to belonging. It's been really hard to be apart. We're not wired to be apart. We're wired to be together. We're tribal people. The history of humanity is the history of family, of clan, of kin, of tribe, of community. And there is no more extraordinary community, in my opinion, than the USC community, a community that represents 150 different countries, all 50 states, and every spiritual and philosophical perspective that's ever been articulated. That's part of the solution to the world's great crisis. And we miss that. Everything we do at USC is predicated on being together, from patient care to teaching to mentoring to athletics to creative expression to residential life to community service and civic engagement. It all requires us to be in person. And so for me, the promised land is being back together. It's being in tribe. It's being able to see each other again in each other's experiences and to not take each other for granted ever again.
I'd love to jump in, and I want to say I just do want to say how much I am loving hearing all of you talk, and it is inspirational to me. Varun, you always almost bring me to tears with the beauty of your ideas, and in a good way, in a very wonderful way. When I think of Promised Land, what came to me this time was the beloved community from MLK, because this whole period is very tied for me, I think, like it is for all of us, with this blending of what's going on in the pandemic, the inequalities, the justice call, the cries for that came out this summer, and the continuing aspiration to build the community we really believe in. And so I keep seeing those as having very much similarity. And when you think about what the desert is, it's the opposite of the promised land, the opposite of the beloved community. It's a place where we don't have justice, we don't have equity, we don't have empathy or care for fellow human beings, and the humanity, the things that you've all talked about, it's that. And I'm really interested to hear Sara and Nicole, because I'd love to hear from your perspective where you are in life, what that says to you. But it seems very important. And I guess I feel like we may actually make much more progress towards that if we come out of this in a stronger, better way. And that would be something that would have, ramifications all the way across the globe. So that's what brings us back to hope.
Yeah, I'm happy to continue on that dialogue, just in terms of the concept of, this narrowness versus this promised land. I also, similarly, just as a college student going through the pandemic and political inequality and racial inequality and so much hardship right now, thought about it similarly to the way that President Folt articulated it, in a sense that, I see the narrowness and kind of this wilderness as this place of mental and physical chaos, as a place of, narrowness and physicality, as Varun Soni was referencing, just in literally being restrained from my peers and from my friends and family. But in terms of just this wilderness versus promised land aspect, I really do think of it as this, this world we're living in right now does have so much inequality and chaos, in a sense, that I categorize as the wilderness. And when I think of promised land, I was debating, is the promised land the past? Is it like a year ago before the pandemic? I don't think so, because there was still inequality then and there was still hardship. Is the promised land next year? No, because I don't really think everything will be just magically fixed. That's just my realistic perspective in that. And so I think the promised land, in my ideal view, is just this space of mental and physical harmony and of acceptance, and this space of empathy. And I don't know if that's ever a space that can be acquired in its full extent, but I think that's kind of like my ideal hope and dream in terms of the promised land. And I think of it in connection to the Jews and the promised land being Israel, and finally getting there, and there's still hardship there, and there's still inequality and struggling. And so I think, in a simple term, the promised land is just more of a safe and welcoming community, kind of to echo off of that as well.
And going off of what I agree with what all of you have said, the only thing that I have to really add is I kind of wonder, I don't know what the promised land looks like. I have no idea. I don't know if we can ever get there. Like, I hope, like, in an ideal world, to be happy, healthy, comfortable. And I think that at different points in our lives, we feel that differently. But I also don't know if there's a way to get to that ideal, all encompassing, perfect place. I think we just really have to work hard to get there. And I think that's going to take work for the rest of our lives to get to a promised land of some sort at certain times, but also being okay for it not to be perfect at all moments, always.
You make me think, just briefly to say one more thing about the promised land. I think maybe it's over my life, I've begun to feel that it's not that I have to have a promised land. The promised land is the process of always trying to achieve it. And in that way, you find those moments of that peace and serenity in the fact that you don't have to get there. You have to be always trying. And that's probably been taking me a long time to have that peace from that thought. And I don't know, Dave, or others of you that have that's a little bit how it feels to me now. And it might not have been the same had you asked me when I was at a different point in my life.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for offering that piece of guidance, because I just think that it really speaks so deeply to just human nature and just positivity and kindness. And it's very uplifting to myself. So I just wanted to say thank you. I appreciate it so much.
The journey itself is where the meaning gets made. I think that's so insightful, and I totally agree with this notion. You referenced the beloved community. I think every community has its language for what they're describing, and they know what that means, right? And they know that's what they're trying for. And as someone who was when I tell my story, I sometimes tell it this way, as having been a graduate student at USC and spent a couple of years away from LA, and then having the chance to come back here and do this work. At first I think I was joking with myself. I'm returning to the promised land, right? But the promised land is not the corner of Hoover and Jefferson. The promised land is something about the Trojan family, is something about what it means to be connected, to be striving for something higher, to be linked in a way that isn't connected just to the physical space or to some sort of tangible objective goal. I can already picture myself welcoming our next class of Trojans in August, hopefully in person, and hopefully telling some version of this story about what it means to be part of this place. But it's not about the place, it's about the belonging, as Dean Soni said. And if we're striving for that, then we are on the right path. I want to echo Nicole's thanks to Dr. Folt for being here and for being our partner, for supporting our community, for serving so selflessly the USC community, to Dean Soni, who has been with us through all manner of journey and stayed with us and stood by our side. And most of all, to Sara and Nicole. Our community is defined by its successful student leadership. It is what that intangible thing is that we know we have to offer that every other campus probably wishes they had. you know, and it's always an honor to work together. And thank you all for this, and wishing all of you, wherever you are, celebrating this time of year, Chag Sameach, and fight on.